Every old house had a room no one was allowed to use. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen, the front room, the parlor, the room with the good sofa and the lace curtains and the framed portraits on the wall. The room you walked past to get to everywhere else in the house. The room that was swept and dusted and kept ready but never actually occupied. If you grew up in a house like that, you probably understood without being told that the room was for company, for Sunday visits, for the minister's call, for Christmas, for the moments when the family needed to show itself at its best. What you may not have been told is what else it was kept ready for. Before hospitals became common, before funeral homes existed, when almost everyone in America died at home, and almost everyone did, the front parlor was the room the family used for the dead. The body was washed and dressed at home. The coffin was carried to the front parlor. The neighbors came through the front door for 2 or 3 days, and then the family carried the coffin out and set the furniture back in its place. The parlor was kept presentable because you could never know exactly when you would need it. The Ladies' Home Journal eventually told American families to stop keeping this room and start living in it. "Call it a living room," the editor said. The name was new, the implication was clear, and within a generation most American families had entirely forgotten what the best room in the house had once been for. Stand in the doorway of the front parlor of a house built in the 1870s. The door is to the left of the main entrance, partially closed on ordinary days. You are not supposed to come in here unless you have been invited. The room is dim, the heavy curtains are drawn against the afternoon light. The furniture is arranged with care, a settee and 2 upholstered chairs positioned near the fireplace, a small table with a glass-shaded lamp, a whatnot shelf in the corner holding figurines, and a few books that have probably never been read. The carpet is the best in the house. On the mantelpiece, a clock ticks under a glass dome. On the wall, framed photographs of people you may recognize and people you may not. Near the window, a small writing desk that no one appears to write at. Everything in this room is slightly too formal for actual use. You have seen this room before, or a version of it, in your grandmother's house or your great-grandmother's house. The room that existed for reasons no one entirely explained. The room where the children were not permitted to play. The room that was cleaned regularly and occupied rarely. The room that stayed ready. This was the front parlor. In the American home of the late 19th century, it occupied a specific and carefully considered position, at the front of the house, closest to the street, accessible through the main entrance without passing through the private family rooms beyond. It was designed to be seen before the rest of the house, to signal something to visitors before they were admitted further. What it was designed to signal was that the family inside had standards, had refinement, had objects worth displaying in a room dedicated to display. The parlor said, "This household is respectable. This family is orderly. This is not a place where people eat at the table and leave their coats on the chairs." The parlor was the house's public face, which meant it had to be maintained, which meant someone had to maintain it. In almost every household where a parlor existed, that someone was a woman. She swept the carpet and dusted the figurines and kept the lamp trimmed and pulled the curtains even and straightened the photographs that vibrated loose in the wall. She did this whether or not company was expected. She did this because the parlor was always expected to be ready, ready for the minister's visit, ready for the Sunday caller, ready for the moment when the house needed to present itself at its best, and ready, though this is the part that was rarely said aloud, for the day when someone in the house would die. In the families that kept these houses, children understood the parlor's rules the way they understood most rules, not through explanation but through consequence. The door was usually closed. You did not open it without permission. You did not run past it, loudly. You did not treat whatever was inside as belonging to your ordinary life. Children in such households sometimes described the parlor as a room they were afraid of, without being entirely sure why. Part of the answer was the formality. the sense that the room existed on different terms from the rest of the house, that the objects inside it were not for use, that the furniture was not for sitting in. But another part of the answer was what children sometimes saw or heard when the door was opened on certain days. Because in the America of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, most people died at home, not in hospitals, not in nursing facilities. At home, in the upstairs bedroom, attended by the family. And when they died, the body did not leave immediately. It came downstairs, it came to the front parlor. Accounts collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s and local histories and diaries from across the 19th century describe this moment in similar terms. The bedroom upstairs was where the person had been ill. The parlor was where they were received after death, where the body was placed in a coffin on a pair of wooden trestles, where the lamps were turned low, where the curtains were drawn the same way they were drawn on ordinary days, except now they would stay drawn. Children in these houses learned that the parlor had two versions of itself. On ordinary days it was closed and still and formal. On the days when the coffin came, it was opened, and then it was the most occupied room in the house. The neighbors came, the minister came, people the family barely knew came and sat in chairs that had been brought from the dining room and arranged in rows. The front door stayed unlocked for 2 or 3 days. The best room became, briefly, the most public room on the block. This is why the parlor was kept ready, not only for the living, who might arrive on any Sunday, but for the dead, who could arrive at any time at all. The reason the name would eventually change from parlor to living room had everything to do with this. But that shift was still decades away, and before it arrived, the room had its work to do. When someone died in the house, the transformation of the parlor began within hours. The furniture was moved to the walls to clear the center of the room. A cooling board or a pair of wooden trestles was brought in, provided by the family, by a neighbor, or by the later decades of the century, by an undertaker who arrived with equipment and took charge of certain tasks. The coffin, when it came, was placed at the center or against the far wall. The coffin itself was a purchased object by this period in many households, ordered from the local cabinet maker, who kept a supply, or from an undertaker who had taken over that trade. Earlier in the century, coffins had sometimes been built by family members or neighbors. By the 1880s, they were more often bought. The room was then arranged for receiving. Chairs were brought from other rooms and set in rows or placed along the walls facing the coffin. Extra chairs might be rented from the undertaker. Lamps were lit and positioned to illuminate the face of the deceased without harsh effect, not for comfort exactly, but for the ritual of looking. Flowers were brought in, lilies most often. Their scent was heavy and purposeful. They meant something about purity and resurrection, and they also served, in a household without refrigeration, a practical function that no one needed to name. Black crepe appeared on the front door and sometimes on the portraits and mirrors inside, though the precise customs varied by household and region and were never universal. The clock on the mantelpiece might be stopped. The curtains were drawn. The room that had been the house's most formal space became, for several days, its most solemn one. The neighbors entered through the front door, which was left unlocked, and made their way directly here. They stood near the coffin. They sat in the rows of borrowed chairs. They spoke in low voices or fell silent. They stayed for a while and then they went home and others came. This is the part of the story that has been most thoroughly forgotten. Not the fact of death at home. Most people know in a general way that this used to be common, but the specific texture of it, the way the room looked and smelled and felt, the way the neighborhood moved through a private house as if it were a temporary public space, the way the family remained present but also in some sense on stage, because the parlor was a stage and grief in the parlor was performed as well as felt. This was not hypocrisy. This was the culture of the room. The parlor had always been a place where the family showed itself at its best. In death, showing yourself at your best meant that the drapes were even, the floor was clean, the flowers were fresh, and the family received their neighbors with composure. What it took to produce that composure, and who produced it, is the next part of the story. Before the neighbors arrived, before the minister came, before the chairs were arranged and the curtains drawn and the coffin placed on its trestles, there was other work. The body had to be washed. In the America of the 19th century, this work was almost always done by women, not by undertakers in most cases. Undertakers were still finding the edges of their profession, and much of their business at this period was limited to supplying coffins and transportation. The actual preparation of the body, washing it, dressing it, arranging it, was domestic labor. It was women's work. Women in these communities understood this. They learned it by watching and then by doing. When a neighbor's child died, the women from nearby households came. When a grandmother died, the daughters and daughters-in-law came. There were women in many communities who had done this many times and who understood the work with the practical knowledge of people who had been trained not by instruction but by experience. Accounts from the 19th century and from the Federal Writers Project describe these women in consistent terms. They came quickly, they worked without ceremony, and they left the body prepared for the room it would occupy. The clothing chosen was almost always the person's best. Sometimes it was clothing set aside for this purpose, a dress, a suit, folded somewhere in the household against the need that would eventually arrive. The hair was combed, the hands were folded, a brooch or a ring might be placed with thought. This labor was invisible in the sense that it was not discussed, but it was not invisible in the sense that everyone understood it was happening. Every woman in the household knew what had taken place in the bedroom before the body came down to the parlor. Every neighbor woman who arrived knew who had done the work. What happened next compounded the labor. Hosting a 2-day wake meant feeding people. It meant maintaining the house in a condition of public readiness while simultaneously grieving. It meant managing children who could sense the disruption without fully understanding it. It meant thanking visitors and accepting condolences and keeping composure while the body of someone they loved was in the next room. The question was never whether the family loved the dead. The question was who would do the work, and the answer, almost always, was the same. The black crepe on the door tells the street what has happened. By now, the neighborhood already knows. The news has moved the way news moves in close neighborhoods, through early morning and the previous evening, through someone who saw the undertaker's wagon and mentioned it to the woman at the next window. The people who arrive through the front door over the next 2 days come for different reasons. Some come because they genuinely love the person who died. Some come because their religion requires it. Some come because the community expects it and their absence would be noticed. Some come because they have lived long enough to know that grief is a door that swings both ways. That today they are paying a visit and someday someone will visit them. They arrive in their better clothes. They remove their hats or their coats in the entrance hall. They approach the coffin. They look. They say what people say when there is no adequate thing to say. They find seats. This was the wake, not a formal service with a minister necessarily. That would come later, often the following day. This was the more informal accumulation of community that preceded it. People staying for an hour or two. Food being passed from the kitchen, funeral biscuits sometimes, or simple bread and coffee, because a house full of mourners still required feeding. The ritual varied by community. In Catholic households, particularly among Irish and Italian immigrants, the wake might be longer and louder. Prayers said in common, the rosary, more open expressions of grief, sometimes songs. In more reserved Protestant households, the atmosphere was quieter, the talk more controlled. Jewish families operated under different customs. The community burial society took responsibility for preparing the body, and the period of sitting Shiva followed burial rather than preceding it. African American families developed their own distinctive traditions, shaped in part by the particular weight that death had carried through slavery and its aftermath. The homegoing, with its music and its theology of release, its insistence that the dead were going somewhere and the community would accompany them to the door. These traditions persisted in the home, and then, as Black funeral homes established themselves across the South and in northern cities, moved into dedicated spaces that honored the same spirit. What united these variations was the basic structure: the body in the room, the community in the chairs, the family between them, and the front door open. Death in the parlor made the household for a few days a public place. Not every family was equal in the parlor. The room told stories about money whether anyone intended it to or not. The quality of the coffin said something. The flowers said something. The mourning clothes the family wore, the black dresses, the black armbands, the black-edged stationery, said something precise about the household's finances and its awareness of what the occasion required. Victorian mourning culture in the second half of the 19th century had developed an elaborate vocabulary of appropriate grief, and much of that vocabulary was available for purchase. Undertakers supplied coffins in graduated qualities. Florists supplied arrangements in graduated scales. The family that could afford the full display could present a death that matched their station. The family that could not had to improvise. Poorer families used simpler coffins, sometimes built by neighbors. They borrowed chairs rather than renting them. They wore their ordinary dark clothing rather than purchasing new mourning dress. Some families had no parlor at all. In tenement apartments and small working-class flats, the front room was the only room, and it served as kitchen, bedroom, and, when the time came, death room. The coffin in a crowded tenement apartment was the same object as the coffin in a Victorian parlor, but the space that held it was different, and the family's ability to produce the proper appearance of respectable grief was different. This is one of the parts of the home funeral story that later nostalgia tends to smooth over. The home parlor wake is remembered as intimate and authentic, as a form of death care that honored the dead in a more genuine way than the commercial funeral home that replaced it. Sometimes that was true, but it was also true that not every family could afford the proper mourning. Not every family had a parlor. The funeral home, when it arrived, offered something to those families too. A space that was already correct, already furnished, already ready, so that the family only had to arrive. Whether that exchange was a relief or a surrender depended on who was doing the calculating. In the second half of the 19th century, a new figure began to appear at the front door of American households when someone had died. He was not a minister. He was not a doctor. He was not a neighbor. He was an undertaker. In the earlier part of the century, the people who supplied coffins and assisted with funerals were usually cabinet makers or furniture dealers who kept a stock of burial goods as a secondary trade. As the century progressed, some of these men began to specialize. They supplied more than coffins. They supplied the cooling board and the trestles, the chairs for the wake, the hearse and the horses, the hired carriages for the procession. And then, after the Civil War, they began to supply something else: embalming. The Civil War had created a problem on a scale no American household had faced before. The dead were dying far from home, and families wanted them back. A surgeon named Thomas Holmes had been offering chemical preservation near the battlefields, and the results, bodies that could survive the rail journey back to the family parlor intact, showed what the technology made possible. After the war, embalming gradually became part of the undertaker's service in civilian life. It changed the arithmetic of home death care. Before embalming, a family had perhaps 2 or 3 days, depending on temperature and season, before decomposition forced burial. After embalming, that window extended. The body could be kept longer, the wake could be scheduled more flexibly. This was useful. It was also the first step in a longer shift. Because once a body was being chemically preserved by a professional, the professional's presence in the house had become substantial. Once the undertaker was providing the coffin and the chairs and the flowers and the embalming and the hearse and the carriages, the household's own management of the death had diminished. He was not yet taking the body away, but he was taking over more of the work that the family and the community had once done themselves. He had noticed something else, too. The families he served had a room in their houses that was perfectly suited to what he was beginning to do. A formal room near the front entrance, already furnished, already kept ready for public occasions. He had the same idea about the rooms in his own establishment. He called them parlors. Stand on the street in front of a building in a mid-sized American city sometime around 1900. The building looks, at first glance, like a house. A larger house than most, perhaps, with a wider entrance and more elaborate trim, but in its basic outline, its front porch, its windows, its position on the lot, it reads as domestic. It is supposed to. Inside, the rooms are furnished in the manner of the best room in a private house. There are carpets, drapes, upholstered chairs, there are flowers, the light is managed for atmosphere, the layout guides visitors toward a room at the center where the body is displayed. This is a funeral parlor, and it has been designed deliberately to look like the room it is replacing. The early funeral parlors and funeral homes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries borrowed their aesthetic from the domestic parlor because they understood that the domestic parlor was the template their customers already knew. Families who had kept wakes in their front rooms would enter a funeral parlor and find something familiar. The function was the same, the ritual was the same, but the house did not belong to them. The undertaker's establishment offered the family something real, relief. Relief from the physical labor of preparing the room and managing the visitors, relief from the pressure of maintaining composure in the middle of their own house, relief eventually from the presence of death in the domestic space where they also ate and slept and raised their children. The parlor was still standing, but the name was about to change, and with the name, everything the room remembered. In 1910, a man named Edward Bach sat down at his editor's desk at the Ladies' Home Journal and wrote a column about parlors. Bach was one of the most influential domestic arbiters in America. The journal was the most widely read magazine in the country. What he wrote about American homes, American women read, and many of them acted on. What he wrote was simple. Stop keeping a room you never use. Open the curtains. Bring in everyday furniture. Let the family live in it. Call it a living room. The term was not entirely new, but Bach's promotion of it marked a cultural pivot. The living room was explicitly a space for the living, for daily family life, for comfort, for relaxed social use. It was the opposite of the formal, occasional, carefully maintained parlor that had characterized the middle-class American home for half a century. The timing was not accidental. By 1910, funeral parlors, were increasingly common in American cities. Hospitals were beginning to claim more deaths. The assumption that death would be staged in the family's front room was weakening. Bach was not the cause of the parlor's decline. He was the editor who noticed it was already happening and gave it a name. Living room. The implication was clear. If this room was now for living, what had it been for before? The answer was not stated in the magazine. It did not need to be. The women who read the column already knew. What changed with the name was not just vocabulary. What changed was permission. Permission to use the best room in the house as an everyday room. Permission to stop keeping it in a permanent state of formal readiness. Permission to let the children in. and permission, quietly, to forget. Once the room was for living, it could put behind it what it had held for the people who came before: the coffin on the trestles, the chairs in rows, the neighbors moving through the front door in their dark clothes, the flowers, the vigil in the night. Families who grew up in living rooms rather than parlors grew up without the direct memory, and the generation after that had nothing to remember at all. By the 1930s and 1940s, hospitals were claiming more deaths. More people died in wards and rooms they had never lived in, tended by professionals they had known for weeks or days or hours. The body left the hospital and went directly to the funeral home. The family came to the funeral home to see it. The domestic parlor was no longer needed for this. The funeral home had already arranged itself to provide everything the parlor had provided: the room, the chairs, the flowers, the subdued lighting, the space for community gathering. But now, as a purchase service in a dedicated commercial building, the family did not have to rearrange their furniture, they did not have to host the neighbors, they did not have to manage the labor of death care in the middle of their ordinary household. This was genuine relief for many families, particularly in urban households where space was limited and community networks had thinned. What survived was more varied than any single narrative suggests. In rural communities, in tight religious congregations, in black churches in the South and North, in immigrant neighborhoods where the old customs had not fully released their hold, home funerals continued longer than in cities. The homegoing tradition in African American communities, with its music and its theology of departure, persisted in Black-owned funeral homes that understood themselves as extensions of community rather than mere service providers. These were not identical to the home parlor wakes of the 19th century, but they preserved the essential idea that death belonged to the community, that the passage of the dead was a collective event rather than a private transaction. In most of the country, that idea grew quieter. Death became something that happened elsewhere. Go back to the house from the beginning of this video. The house built in the 1870s with its formal front room, its curtains, its carpet, its clock under its glass dome. Stand in that doorway again. The room looks the same, the proportions are the same. The position near the front entrance is the same. The curtains are still there, though perhaps lighter ones now. The upholstered furniture is still there, though different pieces. The mantelpiece is there. What is different is what stands against one wall: a television. This is the living room. It has been the living room since sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, when the parlor furniture was rearranged for everyday use and the family was given permission to stop keeping the room for company. Children play here now, people eat here. In the evenings, the family gathers around the screen on the wall the same way their grandparents gathered around the fireplace. The coffin is gone, the trestles are gone, the rows of borrowed chairs are gone. The black crepe that once hung above the door has not appeared here in decades. The neighbors no longer come through the unlocked front door and make their way to this room. Time equals, quote, 0.8 seconds, quote, / greater than most people who live in this house do not know what happened here. They know it is the living room. They know it is for living. They do not know that the room was named for living specifically because it used to belong in part to the dead. The American home, for most of its history, made room for death. Not reluctantly, not as an aberration, but as one of the things that happened in a house. The same house where the family ate and slept and raised their children and received their neighbors. The same room that held the Sunday guests, held, on other days, the coffin. The same curtains that dimmed the room for company dimmed it for a wake. The same women who swept the carpet for a minister's visit washed and dressed the body for the room's other purpose. Then the hospitals came. Then the funeral parlors came. Then the living room came. And the house became a place that made room for comfort and privacy and everyday life and quietly handed death to someone else. The room is still here. Most people walk past it without knowing what it used to hold.